Hey, hey, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. Get started here shortly. Hey, Eleanor, I love the afternoon exclamations. That's I love the energy. Yeah, say hello in the chat. Share my screen here in a little bit. All right, I'm going to start with a quick intro video. Flag and hear it and see it.
Thank you for joining us today. While we're waiting for folks to join, we'd like to share a little bit about our work.
The National Alliance to End Homelessness is a non-partisan organization committed to preventing and ending homelessness in the United States.
We build knowledge using research and data to discover what works to end homelessness, and then we develop easily accessible knowledge about these solutions.
Based upon this knowledge, we improve policy through educating opinion leaders and policymakers about what works and try to build strong policy in support of solutions.
We help communities implement those solutions through our Center for Capacity Building, which includes our Center for Learning, providing training, technical assistance, and tools to providers and public agencies.
We bring the field together: policymakers, researchers, practitioners, philanthropy, and advocates to address key issues in the effort to prevent and end homelessness.
Thank you on behalf of the Center for Capacity Building for joining us today. We'll get started in just a moment.
Learn more about our services at endhomelessness.org and look for training at the top of our site. Or email us at thecenter@naeh.org. And thank you again for joining us today.
Hopefully you all was able to hear that. Welcome, especially in this moment. We appreciate your time, the energy you bring to this work, and we're going to have a really wonderful conversation. Today is the first part of our Leading in the Moment series, really focus on decision-making, coordination, system flow, and focus on housing stability. Today is our first call, really focused on leading through change, governance, coordination, inclusive decision-making, uplifting courageous leadership, and how by aligning governance, information sharing, and really looking at ensuring that we have smooth cross-agency coordination while focusing on accountability, whilst maintaining a housing focus, and while external pressures continue to evolve and show up on our front door. So kudos to you all, but it's going to be a really exciting conversation that we're going to have today. We shared a little bit in the video about what we do, but the Alliance is a nonprofit organization committed to ending homelessness. We do that through our policy and advocacy work, through our research institute and our data analysis, and then our capacity building, which I'm a member of here. And I didn't introduce myself. My name is Josh Johnson. I am the Vice President of Training and Technical Assistance with the Alliance. Use he, him, his pronouns. And again, I am super excited to be here today. So really quick, these spaces, we try to keep them open and for the chats to open, have conversations, but we also want to ensure that we have a safe space for everyone and also ultimately a brave space. We want to have conversations. We want to be able to share our opinions and our thoughts, but we have to do that in a way that is respectful. So we will not tolerate any discrimination, any violence, any abusive language. And if we do witness that, you will be removed from this call. So we always start quickly with what we mean by an effective system and like what we're working to build or continue to build is a system that operates by working towards a goal where when safe and appropriate, people are diverted from becoming homeless, and when they do experience homelessness, they are connected to the housing as quickly as possible, with the goal of making homelessness rare, brief, or one time. So the end game is to really look at how do we analyze if we're working towards this overarching goal. We look at people in the housing crisis have access to immediate help, including a safe place to go. We know that we'll see that people are not experiencing unsheltered homelessness. And if they are, they're not experiencing long periods of time homeless within the community. People are exiting the homelessness quickly and also not cycling back into homelessness, right? We're providing those wraparound supports to ensure stabilization. Everyone has equitable access to housing. No group is disproportionately represented amongst those experiencing homelessness. Right. So these are the goals these are the things that we're working towards to get to that end goal, and the signs of what's going to happen, what we'll see if we are meeting those goals. So we also are making sure investments and decision making and resources are allocated with a coordination in mind. Right. A lot of times we do work across the country, and we'll see communities who have like a really great programs. They have this new initiative. They have this other great pilot project happening. But there's no coordination. There was no thought of how this is actually going to impact the entire system. So you just have a lot of really great resources and interventions, but there's not a lot of flow, and things are happening and working together, right? So if we do have those coordination, that conversations, we will see more of the resources that we develop, the interventions we put in place, work in alignment and work together to ensure that we're all working towards the same end goal. So the question is, right, like, what do we need to reach the goals? And that's kind of the goal of these series and the goal for our conversations today. We need courageous and bold leadership. We need a coordinated homeless response system, no matter the funding of the interventions in the community, the funding of the providers, no matter what the mission of each of the programs who work towards ending homelessness. We need coordination amongst all folks who are touching folks experiencing homelessness to ensure that we are all working towards the same goal. We also have a overall goal that delivering housing services to meet the needs of all folks experiencing homelessness, and maximizing stability while maximizing self-sufficiency. And then really looking to create action steps to end and prevent homelessness and prevent returns to homelessness. In order to do that, we need strong governance. We need a strong board governance structure that includes, at the very least, one person experiencing homelessness. But we encourage and know that it should be more than one person. Right? We have to ensure that we're wrapping folks around with support, and we're not tokenizing individuals for their experience as they're part of the decision-making body. Because the folks who are closest, who have been experienced our systems, are the best at telling us what didn't work and what could potentially work to improve that. We've seen that when board chairs should not be a homeless service provider. We've seen in communities who have high efficient governance structures, they're adjacent institutions that are holding up the chair and moving it forward. Right, that really creates alignment and ensures it's not a conflict when we're making decisions. We also have to hold up the community mirror, that, like my colleague Mary Francis will say, ensure that we're representing the people who are experiencing homelessness in our community. Right? Are we engaging with the right programs and providers to reflect the folks that we're serving? Also, understanding the role of the lead agency. Right? The lead agency should not be the decision maker. Right? It's not the board. The lead agency provides the backbone support for the governance structure. They can provide leadership, they can provide guidance, they can hold people together, but ultimately the decision making should be with that the governance structure. It has to be grounded in decision and data, right? Both qualitative and quantitative, right? Understanding that the outcome, how the breakdown of the governance structure, there shouldn't be no constituencies with more than 35% of the seats, and that includes homeless service providers. We have to ensure, and this is one of the biggest things that we see when we do work across the country, is that there has to be clarity in role, who does what, where does the authority lie, who has responsibility for what, and who are we accountable to, and that should be outlined in our charter, and everybody should be a part of that onboarding, and everybody should have that on a continuous basis of learning, right? Because when we don't, a lot of times these meetings end up turning into updates of what's happening in the community. Maybe sometimes I'm sure you all can see like venting sessions of all the things that need to happen, and are really great meetings around keeping notes and making sure that we're following all the laws. But there's not a lot that's getting done, and not a lot of clarity that's being produced by these conversations. Also, utilizing subcommittees effectively, right, and that they're ensuring that they're providing recommendations to the overall board for acceptance and not or not. And then also having clear ways to ensure that folks, when there's a conflict in place, that people are not making funding decisions on their own of funding that really impact their own organization, right, and other potential conflicts. So I'm just, again, setting the stage of some of the things I'm going to talk about. What do we mean when we say certain things? What do we mean when we say homeless response system, an effective system, when we say an effective governance, right? And also, one of the things is that I didn't talk about is signs of challenges to effective governance. Well, we've seen this too. It's micromanaging or inadequate resources or support, lack of transparency and clarity, lack of data decision. It's a lot of like who's the loudest voice in the room, and who maybe has the most sway is how decisions are being made. There is not any shared performance benchmarks or accountability in the room or in the homeless response system. There's a resistance to any type of change, and a lack of a clear ultimate goal for the entire structure in the system, and also including the governing body. So those are some of the challenges. Here are some of the things we consider to be best practices. But I'm gonna stop talking and really speaking of strong leadership. I have the opportunity and the privilege to welcome our CEO at the Alliance, who's going to share a message, Anna Levin.
Thank you so much, Josh. And hi, everybody. I am so happy to be here with you all today to kick off our series on leadership. I think, as Josh just laid out, you are in for a great conversation today with the incredible leaders you have that we have on the panel alongside our own team of leaders here at the Alliance. And I think I don't have to tell the 130 something people on this webinar today that we have a lot going on in our sector. And we could spend our time focusing on any one of a number of important topics that are in our portfolio. So why are we talking about leadership? And we're talking about leadership exactly because we have a lot going on in our sector. Without leadership at all levels, we can't sustain forward momentum. And Josh talked a little bit about this in his introduction. And we're also talking about leadership in part because the times that we are living and working in call for it. Building and refining leadership skills and approach, identifying and mentoring emerging leaders so we have a bench, talking to each other as leaders, all of these are really, really important parts of our work that can take a back seat when we don't make time for them. So we decided to make time for them, both through the Leadership Summit that we held earlier this year in San Diego and through discussions like this one today. And I just want to say before I get started, really, that I'm grateful to the members of our capacity building team led by Josh Johnson, who you just heard from, for making the time for these kinds of discussions. I think it's really important. And I thought I might start by talking a bit about my own leadership journey for a minute. And I'll say that I am now old enough to know that I am a natural leader. I didn't always know it, but I know it now. And here's how I know it. So some of you out there in the audience, if you know anything about me, you know that I ran the special needs programs at HUD for 10 years. So 2007 through 2017. And while it wasn't my first management position, it was one of my first real national leadership positions. After more than a decade in the field, working on continuum of care work, much like what Josh just talked about, doing technical assistance, disaster recovery, HMIS implementation, and a bunch of other related work. And so I went into that 10 years having good field experience, but not really understanding necessarily what it meant for myself to be a leader in the way that I needed to be a leader to be successful. And that 10 years at HUD was really hard, not the kind of hard that we have now, just to be clear. It was mostly the kind of hard that, like, when you have the opportunity to make a difference, when you have really strong support and you have a vision to work with, when you have those things and you don't want to mess up or let people down, it was that kind of hard. And during some of the hardest times in my tenure at HUD, I cried on my way to work. Not on my way home from work, on my way to work, because I knew the kinds of decisions that I would have to make over the course of the day. I knew what kinds of challenges I would have to be facing over the course of a day. And once I counted that somebody, one of my staff or somebody from somewhere else within the department, stopped in my door 18 times, not one person, like over the course of the day, 18 times somebody stopped in my door and asked me for a decision on something. And the decisions that many of us make, including the people who are on this panel and people who are in the audience here today, the decisions that many of us make can be life or death. They can make someone's life better or worse. They can be the difference between somebody laying their head on the sidewalk at night or in a bed. And as a leader, that can be a heavy burden to carry, especially day in and day out. And during this time, I told a friend that I wanted to leave this work and I wanted to go work at Pottery Barn. And no diss to Pottery Barn. Like, that's a great job. If you have family that work at Pottery Barn, I'm all for it. But I said I wanted to go work at Pottery Barn so I wouldn't feel what I call the pressure of command, the pressure that leadership requires of you, both from yourself, if you're a good leader, from yourself, as well as from all of the external sources that impact you as a human being and you as a leader. And what my friend said to me, I will never forget it. What she said was, well, you would just be in charge of Pottery Barn in like 2 years. So you might as well go ahead and do the thing that you feel passionate about, because I don't think that you feel passionate about furniture. Again, more power to you if you do, but like, you might as well do the thing that you feel passionate about and make a difference. And that's how I know that I'm a natural leader, because what she said to me was true. And from that day forward, I have tried to be as intentional as I can in the way that I approach leadership. Because being inclined towards leadership naturally doesn't mean that it's easy or that you don't have to work at it. And I want to be super clear with everybody in this audience. I work at it every single day. Ask any of my staff who are on this webinar today. They see that I work at it. I try to be as intentional as I can about leading with humility and transparency. I foster leadership in others so that we have a team of people that are coming up behind me and that are empowered to lead in their areas. I try to have courage, even though some of the decisions that I have to make are frankly terrifying. And I know I don't always get it right. And when I don't, I try to model apologizing when it's needed or taking responsibility when it's needed. I also try to give credit when things go right and take responsibility when they don't. But all of that is a practice. And I hope that by hearing from your colleagues here on the panel today, that you are in a place to further develop your own style and practice so that our field continues to get stronger over time. Because right now, we need strong leadership at all levels more than ever. And I'll end my opening with what I talked about in the opening plenary of our leadership summit a few months ago in San Diego. At the Alliance, we have a specific organizational approach to leadership. We channel our energy and maybe sometimes our rage, but mostly our energy, into developing a plan and a direction. We execute on that plan, we make adjustments when we need to, and we keep moving. We bring people along when we need to, and we fight when we need to. We go back to our values when decisions are hard. Because leadership to me, and I think to most of my staff, it's about four main things. It's about showing up in your unique way with your unique skills. It's about being focused on the goal, even when there are distractions. It's about recognizing the urgency of the moment and moving accordingly. And maybe most importantly, leadership is about keeping a through line of joy and love and purpose, because without that piece of the puzzle, the rest of it isn't sustainable. And I hope that by participating in this series, you can find ways to sharpen your own skills and style and bring ideas back to your communities. And most importantly, learn from our amazing group of Alliance staff and the partners that we have with us. And so with that, I thank you all again. I thank all of the panelists for being with us today. I thank all of the folks who are in the audience for being here. And I'm going to turn it over to Marquetta to start digging in. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for that beautiful message, Anne. We really need that at this time. Well, hi, everybody. My name is Marquetta Body. I am a senior technical assistant specialist here with the National Alliance to End Homelessness. I'm also a part of the capacity building team. And I'll be moderating today for our panel. I'm really excited about the depth of the expertise on this panel. We have people who are from different communities, who work every day in governance, working through coordination, and also just figuring out how to make decisions to improve housing outcomes. And so I will pass it to Emily to introduce herself briefly, and everyone else will go after her. I think Josh is going to put the names up there, and then we'll jump right into our Q&A.
Hey, all, good afternoon. I'm Emily Ball. I manage the Homeless Strategy Division at the City of Asheville in North Carolina. We are the CoC lead and the HMIS lead for the Asheville-Buncombe Continuum of Care.
And hi, everybody. I'm Danielle Meister. I'm the Assistant Secretary for the Division of Homeless Solutions at Maryland DHCD. And today I'll be sharing sort of from two hats. We're both the Maryland Balance of State Continuum of Care Lead Agency, and then obviously a state housing agency.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lahela Maddox. I'm the Chief Operations Officer with the Regional Task Force on Homelessness in San Diego. We are the continuum of care for the City and County of San Diego. We are a true nonprofit, and we encompass all functions of the continuum of care, the collaborative applicant, we are the HMIS administrator, CES lead, et cetera. So nice to be here with you all. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jonathan Russell. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm the director for Alameda County's Housing and Homelessness Services Department. We are, as Lahela mentioned, a government-based CoC lead, so collaborative applicant, HMIS, coordinated entry, all the rest. but also the strategic lead, or at least try to be for the broader work and resources in our system, state and local investments to try to collaborate and coordinate a unified response. I'm based in Alameda County, which is in the Bay Area of California, so across from San Francisco, in a large urban California coastal system. Glad to be here.
Awesome. Thank everyone for the introductions. And so to help us ground the conversation, could each of you briefly describe your community's governance structure? We know they vary, right, from community to community. And who is involved in the decision making and the role that governance plays in setting priorities in your community? And this is for everyone. So whoever wants to start first is free to jump off.
I'll take it. Well, first of all, I'm so glad to be here. I love governance. It turns out I really have turned into a big governance nerd. And this is coming from our experience with the National Alliance to End Homelessness. One of those pictures of Josh in that opening video was Josh in our community telling us that we needed to get it together around governance a few years ago. And so we did. And it has really been transformational in how we work around homelessness in our community. So very literally, the Alliance recommended that we rebuild our COC. We did that 2 years ago, February of 2 years ago. The way that we are built is to be all-encompassing around the issue. So regardless of service delivery approach, regardless of funding stream, we're certainly compliant with federal regulations for COCs. But we are meant to be sort of a whole community body based on or focused on homelessness response. So really, if you're on the field, you're on the team, and we want you to be participating in this collaborative. You can stay in your lane. We just want to be sure that all of those lanes are aligned and that we're on a shared highway moving in a common direction. We have a 600 or so person membership body. Membership is open to anyone in the COC with an interest in understanding homelessness and taking action to address it. That's the threshold. So wide open for folks to join as a member at any time. Members then elect a board of directors with a really specific composition that's laid out in our charter. So we have a sector-based board that is the decision-making body for our COC. Those sectors are subject matter experts with lived experience of homelessness. We have local government partners, so city, county, VA, and housing authority. We have 5 service providers. We have system partners, healthcare, behavioral health, public safety, and non-governmental funder. And then we have community partners, so community representatives like neighborhood associations, business community, and faith community. Our board is not meant to be people with issue expertise, but is meant to be people who can make things happen in our community. So really bringing together decision makers across sectors to sit at a common table around that issue. They must agree to our shared values and guiding principles, of course, must be a COC member, but again, not meant to be issue experts. For us, issue experts really sit at the committee and work group level. That is where the real substantive work of the COC takes place. We have 6 standing committees. They're all appointed by the board. They're all COC members. They make recommendations to the board, and then we have some time-bound work groups that can be appointed by either the board or by committees. And then lead agency role was really a critical learning for us. A lead agency in our community is positioned as very neutral backbone support. So we, the City of Asheville, are the lead agency for the continuum of care, but we really clearly differentiate between that function and city as municipal government responding to homelessness. So my job and my team's job in our division is fully focused on that lead agency function. Separately, we have a dedicated seat on the board for city leadership that's currently an assistant city manager, and then our mayor is also on the board. And we have other city staff at other seats throughout committees and work groups, but really very clean lines between our lead agency role and city as local government responding to homelessness. So overall, our structure is meant to create a lot of seats at the table, but in a very clear, very organized way. All the board, all committees, and all work groups are required to have at least one person with lived experience of homelessness, making sure that we have that expertise as a decision maker alongside other decision makers in our structure.
I can jump in. Yeah, governance. So we're in California, and California urban areas, which for better or worse means that there really is a mixed kind of structure of how governance works in California, mostly because for reasons we appreciate, there's a fair amount of state sources through many different departments that come into our system, some that flow through the county, some through cities. So in a lot of ways, I think one of the blessings and flaws of California, I'm sure like other state systems, is that our CoC funding represents about 17% of the total funding each year that we're administering in our county, or all the partners are. So invariably that creates this multifaceted governance structure for us. And we're also the lead agency for the CoC. So we also have a board. We have a very complex, long, and I'll be candid, I think a little bit overbuilt current governance structure that is biting us right now as we're being pressed into what I know Marquetta will discuss later, of like these more nimble decision making. So we're actually in a process of looking again at our CoC governance structure to really try to clarify our scope and role and board. We have a really high bar we're proud of in terms of representation on our board. So 33% at least of all committees, work groups, leadership board have folks with lived experience present and participating. We try to represent the racial demography of our community and the point time count also to have that representation. But in California, one of the things we're trying to really reckon with, I guess, in the Bay is also naming that there just isn't a single table for decision making, right? The CoC is the space where we've got, the federal funding and some of the state funding vis-a-vis HAP, which is the state source that also has a connection to the CoC. And then we've got a lot of local governments, cities, as Emily mentioned, the county and multiple county departments that have differing authorities, right? So we have a board of supervisors over the county and city councils that really do, at the end of the day, retain their decision making. So we try to be the glue. I try to think of like the county wants to be those ligaments that try to make this diverse body make sense together. But part of that, I think, it involves for us acknowledging that some of the fractured nature of our system is baked in to not having clear authority and system investments in homelessness that have, at least at our state level, like statutory roles like we do for the CoC. So we're trying to voice that and also say, in the midst of that, how can we use the unifying kind of driver for governance for us within and beyond the CoC is really using our community plan. So we have a 5-year community plan that we're refreshing right now to really kind of root our system in that collective strategy and values in a way that hopefully can draw in the multiple layers of governance that are different bodies, right, with different authorities. We, unlike Emily's setup, do not have elected officials on our CoC board. That was a strategic decision on our part. We have had different seasons in the past where we did, and there's different effects, but that invariably means that there's a lot of decision-making tables also outside of that they're doing. So we're trying to really use the plan to drive these multi-governance bodies to go in the same direction, and use the CoC as an anchor point to try to draw in as much of those decision makers to that table as well.
Maybe I'll go next since I'm also in California, if that's okay, Danielle, just to build off of what Emily and Jonathan have described. So in San Diego, well, I'll also highlight for California, if folks aren't familiar with our state, we have 44 continuums of care in the state of California, and they all look different. Many are embedded in government, but even where they're embedded varies, right? Public health, social services, parks and rec for some of them, or cities. And then there are a few of us that are true nonprofits, and then we also have joint powers authority, right? So one of the challenges we have in California is that we all look very different. So we always say, well, I think we say this across the country, when you see one CoC, you've seen one CoC. But we do still have some of these core functions that Emily and Jonathan have already described sort of in their structure. Also in San Diego, I think broadly, we really think of governance as a shared responsibility rather than a single entity making decision. In our community, really recognizing that we sort of have this three-pronged stool, right? We have the city of San Diego, very large. We have our county, which also has multiple unincorporated areas. And then we have the CoC that is a true nonprofit. And then we have in total 18 jurisdictions in San Diego, the largest number of federally recognized tribes in the country. Again, both like city, urban, rural, like we sort of have it all in San Diego. We're like the size of a small state. So that has its own challenges around governance, but simply our structure, again, is really designed to bring together local governments, providers, people with lived experience, other funders. And so formally, our continuum of care is governed by a 34-member board that represents multi-sectors, right? Local governments. We do have electeds on our board, which include a board of supervisor, typically the president of the city council at that time, and then we have a variety of other representation to really try to bring that larger demographic and representation. And then so the board, through our charter and all of their typical COC things, really establishes our policies, our priorities, and strategic direction for the continuum of care. And then RTFH serves as the lead agency. So of course, we are supporting the implementation, coordination, planning, HMIS administration. We have an MOU or an MOA with our COC that designates us to fulfill, all of these roles on behalf of our community. And then, of course, we have our standard, standing committee. And then we have ad hoc committees that address, whatever the priority community, which can constantly evolve as well, right? So a lot of our work happens through the committees, through the advisory groups. We are a community that does a lot of public engagement processes, input from our providers and folks with lived experience to really try to balance the formal governance with a broader stakeholder engagement. Is really important for us in San Diego. And then I think, what we've really learned around our governance, and it's gone up and down, is that it's not just about, right, who votes or who makes the decisions. It's also about how that information flows between how stakeholders are engaged, how we build trust. Again, in a very large community that also is somewhat traditional or sort of old school in that sense, is that, it takes a lot. It's a lot about relationships in this work and making sure that we are doing our due diligence about relationship building, effective communication. How do we really partner is really something that we work hard at in San Diego, given the very different dynamics in, throughout our region, is that even if you have a governance structure, right, and you can have these things, written down and in policies, I think what we've learned in San Diego, in leadership is that it's also about the relationship building, because otherwise, right, those structures can become, a hindrance or, a barrier if you don't have some of that in place. And then I'll just add one thing and then I'll pass it to Danielle is we actually took a little bit different approach around our regional plan. We did create a regional plan. And as Jonathan said, we use that as sort of how to keep, folks moving in the right direction. But instead of just updating our regional plan, what we've done over the years is create these one-pagers because our regional plan is massive, right? It includes so much information and people don't actually know how to implement that oftentimes. So we've taken the approach to do one-pagers, which sort of narrow what we're trying to achieve through the regional plan. And then that becomes our guiding document and the way that we can show data or show best practices and really engage our board and our community. Our other communities can use that when they're speaking to their own communities or an application. So instead of just updating this large, massive document every 5 years, we've kept that as the baseline and then created like these one-pagers that help move our governance along as well. So anyways, I'll pause there and pass it to Danielle.
Great, thanks so much. We, I think, are maybe a little unique in the sense that we're a balance of state COC. So for us, we're covering now 12 counties. As of a couple months ago, we just merged our 8th COC into the balance of state. And I sort of think of us as like a baby COC because we've only been around for 5 years. So prior to 2020, Maryland had 16 different continuums of care, which is it's a lot for the size of our state. And so in 2020, 5 CoCs merged together. They're the group that selected the state housing agency as their lead agency. So we are both the CoC lead and the HMIS lead. We also run the back end of coordinated entry, but most of the day-to-day functions are still carried out at the local level. And since then, the original merger, we've added 2 CoCs in the last couple of years, one in April, and then we anticipate adding possibly our last CoC later this year. And so if that happens, we'll be up to 17 counties, which is over about 2/3 of the state. So it's been definitely an adventure. We spent a lot of our time doing technical things like HMIS mergers and getting everybody's data quality to be really great. But governance was a really big focus for us in the first couple of years. And then now we're getting sort of ready to revisit that given the NOFO requirements and some of the things that we're just observing on our own about our governance structure. So we have multiple layers of governance being a balance of state. We have our CoC board, which is about 34 members. About half of those folks are regional representatives from what we call local homeless coalitions. So LHCs are sort of the former CoC leadership body at the local level. When we created the balance of state, those groups continued to meet and continued to drive a lot of the local planning. It's really difficult at a state level to be that involved in the day-to-day coordination of county services and things like that. So we still have local, like regional planning bodies, county level planning bodies. They elect their membership up to the CoC board. So about half of our board is comprised of those folks, and they cover a range of types of positions. They might be local elected officials, they might be a local service provider, they might be the health department or social services. We don't establish any requirements for who the LHC can vote up. It's their own local process, and they also develop their own election processes. So one of the things we're looking at is whether we might want to tweak that and maybe establish board level protocols for the LHCs to follow in electing their representatives. And then the other half of the board is folks with lived experience and membership from state agencies. So when we first formed the balance of state, the service providers really wanted more interaction and support from state agencies. So we designed a governance charter that would help create that. And now what we're looking at is, should we be adding seats for things like at-large representatives? Should there be more of a role for elected officials or business folks, people from other sectors? And then one seat I forgot to mention is just our statewide domestic violence advocacy organization. They also sit on the board. So I think one of the first things that we did that I would definitely recommend CoCs consider, we were really specific about not just using a governance charter to establish roles and responsibilities, but also really detailed MOUs. So we have an MOU as the CoC lead and HMIS lead that very clearly spells out what our role is and how far we can go. So it specifies things like, are we recommending funding recommendations, or are we deciding and informing? So our MOU clarifies a lot of those sort of nitty-gritty operational details that sometimes a governance charter lacks details on. So for us, they're like a package that we use together. And we have really clear committees that are made up of board members. We have, I would say, a limited committee structure. We're really focused on sort of day-to-day operations. The thing that we're in the midst of wanting to expand to is having more like resource allocation groups, or groups that can do fundraising, groups that can do strategic resource investment across the balance of state area. So in terms of like our growth space, we've been really focused on compliance, and now we're starting to organize ourselves around performance and better system coordination. And just one thing I'll add is, I think it sounds like we're similar to Asheville in that within my division of staff, we have a whole team that is just the CoC, and that's their only job. So we wall off who staffs the CoC and who works on behalf of the governance board, which is another word choice we've been intentional about. And then the rest of my team are wearing more of like the state housing agency hat.
Thank you all for that. And that's really important to share because I think the governance structures vary from, like I said, community to community. And we're always evolving, right? I always say that governance policies and procedures, bylaws, all those things, they're working documents, right? They are not ever finished. There's always something that comes up or that maybe has to change. So thank you so much for sharing that. And so with me mentioning that, governance is always changing, governance often looks strong on paper. But the real test is how decisions are made in practice. So when priorities shift quickly, what helps your community stay grounded and remain courageous in advancing strategies that balance urgent crisis response with long-term outcomes? Maybe we'll
Such
have
an
two people
easy
answer
one.
this. Okay, Jonathan, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just saying such an easy one. No, I mean this is the nut of it, right? I mean this is really the core of the of I think what we are all weathering right now. I will say just to do a quick like kind of get get personal, get vulnerable about this role in this time. I will say for me, just to provide a little bit of background, like I'm new to local government as of like 2.5 years ago. So my whole career was working at large service providers, in direct service work and then administration. And so I took this position in Alameda County as my first step into like formal government role. Um, uh, the same day that in Alameda County, in California, we passed some transformative state legislation, Prop 1, which is radically changing our behavioral health system and affecting homelessness. 2 months later, a little thing called Grants Passed happened at the federal level, and a month later, um, our state level executive orders around encampments and stuff like that. So one of the things that is really, and I just want to shout out, I know Anne probably had to leave to go do something else, but Anne and others have been extremely helpful for me. I mean, I remember I just called a lot of the local government people, like seasoned people when I took this job to say, help me understand how different this is, because this is a different kind of leading, right, than I was used to. And so for me, and this is why the name of this webinar really hit for me, is I always consider myself someone who led through disruption, to be totally candid. Like my leadership was about disrupting systems, what needs to change, what needs to be better. Let's like call it what it is and make difference. And what has been so sobering for me, given all of those external disruptions in our community and our system, and certainly obviously, changing federal priorities, is that it calls for a very different kind of leading through the other sense of disruption, like leading through in the midst of disruption, not by being a disruptor. And so that's been a real challenge for me to say it's radical in this time to be a source of stability and grounding leadership to like stay the course and work with people. But that's a different kind of skill set. So for me, that's been like my growth curve in these couple of years, is really saying that's a whole different set of muscles and strengths that need to be developed. That's what this moment calls for. Um, and so for me, I think in thinking about this question, um, in some ways, I feel like this moment and what this pressure to move quickly does is it surfaces like it's chickens coming home to roost, right? Like if there's fractures and distrust in the system, those are going to be exacerbated by our now having to do some unprecedented work that steps outside of or expedites certain processes. Um, and that's just like we need to kind of reckon with and own that. And so trying to be transparent for us is really naming that. And again, coming back to this question of like, our processes and procedures are being rattled, but that's not what grounds us, right? Our values and commitment to the people we serve is what grounds us. And so we need to camp on that. And in a lot of ways, we need to call the reality that many of our systems, certainly in California, and maybe in the kind of more progressive local government context at the very least, which is my only experience, we are very focused on process and procedure as like the mechanism of participation and kind of input and power. And when our process and procedures are arcane and complex and overbuilt, which they are in many contexts, that can directly work against nimble responsiveness. And so we have to find new ways to consider power and power sharing that aren't just rooted in meticulous participation in procedure and process and the control of that. And so that's something we're facing as a local COC and wrestling with, and trying to address this. Because for us, and just last point, what this is driving us toward is having to lean on other partners, because the resources we're going to be able to go to be, let's candid, like we set to lose a lot of money in our permanent supportive housing with the federal changes with COC, is going to be other sources and other partners, namely local county funding that is not controlled, quote unquote, right, by our COC. So it's pressing us to sort of make decision outside of our own bubble. but it is really challenging, like that, like trust moves at, at the speed of relationships. And this is a time where we need to both lean on those relationships and also recognize it's going to exacerbate some existing tensions. But what we can't do is lock into our corners that are like, well, I can hold this up because I have process and procedure control. Like, how do we not camp on that as systems? Because that's exactly what makes us weaker as a system than really lean into trust. So, yeah.
I think for us in Maryland, I think a couple of things that have been happening for us that have been successful. I think one is being a really clear communicator about what's happening in a time of crisis or in a time of dramatic change and shifts. Making sure that all the stakeholders of our COC are getting regular updates that are proactive, that are clearly communicated, not just here's what's happening, but really like here's what you should do about it, and here's the call to action, or here's how we need people to show up. So I think speaking with a really clear voice and clear communication has worked really well for us. So we now are sending weekly updates to our COC membership about what's going on with grant agreements, what's going on with NOFO awards, and making sure that they're not wondering or, reaching out to HUD on their own without a lot of information. That's just kind of one example. I think the other thing too that we've talked a lot about openly with our board is how do we continue to center our values and our ethics, our commitments to things like housing first, while the tactics might have to change. So things like how are we going to shift to do more transitional housing, but maintain our community-led values around housing first and low barrier services? How can we find the middle of the road to both be compliant and stay centered? And I think the other thing that's really worked for us is having conversations about these things when we're not in a crisis. So scheduling regular time with our board to discuss hard issues and to also gut check where do they land on things like housing first, how committed are they, so that when those policy questions come up, we're not unclear on where everyone stands. And so we have integrated a lot of those conversations into our board meetings over the past couple of years. And then I think just the last thing is we've been very intentional about asking our board members what they feel like they need during these moments where things are not clear or things are shifting around them, and have tried to stand in the gap. So last year in particular, when it was unclear what was going to happen with awards and whether they were going to be renewed, our providers were really clear about, we want language to use with the tenants enrolled in our programs. How do we know when people are going to be impacted by this? So what we try to do is give a lot of resources, give a lot of technical assistance to our service providers. I think beyond maybe what the regular like COC lead might do in those circumstances, to try and make it easy on our providers to do that hard work on the front lines. So what's worked for us really, I think, we've tried a lot of things, but I think the biggest thing has been just communication, like saying the hard parts out loud, facilitating tough discussions, checking in with people between the crisis that happens to really revisit our values and what our core priorities are. I think we do, I'll share all this with the caveat that like we are a newer COC, and most of the people joining our COC are there because they want to be in a balanced estate COC and take state leadership on this issue. I have worked in other COCs where that was not the case, and this would not be like necessarily the tactic I would use. But for our COC, we're really willing partners who are hungry for guidance and hungry for support. I think being a clear and vocal and loud communicator has been the most helpful part of all of this. And then also being willing to do some of the messier things like public advocacy, where some of our nonprofits are not comfortable with public advocacy or working with a congressional member or their local delegate or senator. We've tried to stand in the gap and help them navigate those scenarios, but also be the face of pushing back against policies that the COC has determined are not in the best interests. So being willing to like bear the brunt of some of the public blowback on behalf of the COC as a whole, while also giving the folks who are comfortable with advocacy the tools that they need to do it.
That's good, Daniel. And you kind of already went into like the next question. So I'm gonna pose this to Emily and Lahila. We know that in strong governance systems, inclusion and accountability are essential. And at the same time, communities are often operating in a real-time crisis where conditions and decisions have to be made quickly. What tensions emerge between inclusive decision making and the need for rapid action? And how does your community navigate those practices? And I guess I'm thinking about like, we are intentional about having certain people at the table and making sure that everybody has an opportunity to know what's happening and make a decision. And then when things come up like changes or shifts in priorities or things have to be decided quickly, sometimes we're not bringing everybody to the table. We're trying to make those decisions quickly because sometimes it calls for that. But we want to make sure that we are standing true to our policies and procedures, and there's that tension there. So I'm interested to know if anybody has been navigating that and how you've kind of worked through some of those tensions.
I have, I think, kind of a simple answer to this, and I really like what you just said, Danielle, about I've already obviously forgotten how you said it, but about doing that kind of work outside of the crisis. Because I think for us, I think once we crystallized, which I think we have done, once we crystallized who makes decisions, then this became really easy for us. So I'm not at all unclear about who to convene for which decision when the moment comes. So in the FY25 NOFO, for example, very clear, we got to get our funding committee together. We as staff need to help them understand what this means and how to digest it and what the options are so that they can put together a thoughtful recommendation to go to a called board meeting where they will present that and have the board do their job and discuss what is most important and how it aligns with our existing strategic plan, and then have the board establish priorities and vote on them, and then we go. And we'll follow that same process now. We'll be doing that later this week where our funding committee has met once about the FY26 NOFO, and we'll meet again later this week to really sort of get further in their thinking and put together what they want to take forward to the board, and then the board will discuss at their meeting, vote on priorities, and then we'll move forward accordingly. So I think for us, I'd talk about it being transformational in our community when Josh came to town, but really when the Alliance said, you all are not understanding what governance is meant to be. And we were not. We absolutely did. I didn't understand. Our community didn't understand. And once we got it, and then once we went through that very thorough, long, collaborative process to get to our governance structure, I think it really works for us. We really have a lot to lean on in those times. And so we're able to act very quickly.
Yeah, that was sort of going to be my initial response too, is that along with Danielle and Emily, it's work before that, right? We are fortunate. We have a fantastic leader at our organization, Tamara Kohler. Many of you probably know her, has been our CEO now for 8.5 years. And she, came in and started to build some of that trust and transparency so that as we approach these times, and it doesn't always have to be like this level of crisis, right? If we're thinking about what is our governance structure in advance, what is decision making, what is communication long before a crisis, that obviously brings you at a level in which you don't have as much. But I think one of the things in leadership that we tend to take on and then overlook is that our job is not, like, especially in this work, our goal is not to convince people that everything's going to be okay. Right? Like if you enter leadership thinking that everyone expects you to say that it's going to be okay, and that's what leadership means, that's sort of the wrong way, that's the wrong foot, to put forward, right? It's really about, and then of course, on the flip side, you also don't want to be a leader that's creating like hysteria, right? That the sky is falling, like everything is devastating, right? So where do you find that balance as a leader? And I think, again, it comes back to some of what we've already talked about, is that it's ensuring people understand the challenge at hand, right? What is the challenge? Do we understand the options? Do we, do people have a seat at the table so that we can move through this in a conversation? And then I think if you're a community that's not at that level yet, right, and maybe you are sort of in this transition in the middle of all of these changes, what are some simple things? Maybe none of it's simple, but where could you start? And I think it's really, clarity, right? Who provides input? How do we make decisions? And how do we communicate those decisions? And how do we do it more than just once? One of the things that has really come to surface around communication as of late, especially for me and my role in our organization and our community, is that um, communication can't be one time or one direction, right? That it's really because people don't hear it if they don't think it applies to them. Right. So you can say this is happening, and then people go, oh, okay, right. But it's not until they're like, oh, wait, that's me. Oh, you were talking about me, right? And then their response typically is, well, no one said anything. How come you didn't tell us sooner? Or how come how come you didn't do this? And then we can become defensive of like, no, we told you, like we held this webinar, we sent out this email. And while those are all things, yes, we want to do, I think what we've really learned a lot around our state funding that's been very complex and changes with each. We get a new round of funding every year that's multi-year, and every time it changes, what the goalposts sort of change, right? And so I sort of attribute a little, really, obviously the HUD-NOFO is different, but in that respect of like, we have to be effective communicators as leadership, and that means communicating in different forms and challenging ourselves to not get into the complacency of like, well, we said that, we put that out. Because again, right, we have people with different levels of understanding. We have people with different perceptions, different levels of knowledge. And so how do we do that consistently so that even, right, like that's what's really helped us in San Diego is we are consistent in our messaging. That is something that we talk about all the time, because when there is a question of like, well, when did we decide this? How did we talk about this, right? We can go back, and not to say like, hey, we already told you, but to walk them back through that process. Right, when the first HUD-NOFO came out, we anticipated this and then all the litigation and different things, but we continued that information to our boards. We have 2 boards, continued that information to the boards, and then had listening sessions and then came back to the boards, right? And so we kept that line of communication open, but we also continued to move forward in what is our mission? What are we trying to achieve? Because funding priorities streams of funding will always change. Administrations will change, right? We have to be able to evolve through that. So I think remembering as a leader that our goal is to create some, clarity around these decision making, clarity around how we communicate, and then set some of that foundation. So regardless of the impact, right, or the crisis, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's a funding change, whether it's, an administration change, that we have some guiding principles to sort of move us through that. But I think, just ultimately, I would say the fallacy is that we as leaders are always supposed to make it okay. And I think in leadership, we have to recognize that there are hard conversations and we can't just say it's going to be okay. We have to, sort of be willing to have that hard conversation, sort of push back and stand up and sort of hold that role about what is our mission and vision as a collective group, and then move forward in that way.
Well, Hella, that's a really great point, which takes me into my next question. I don't know if Jonathan, you want to answer this one, but when we talk about communication and transparency and shared data, and those are all often essential for building trust and accountability across partners. So what governance structures or communication processes or practices, and data sharing processes have been effective in keeping partners informed, aligned, and moving towards a shared goal? And anybody can answer, but I'm saying Jonathan.
Yeah, I mean, I just love listening to the rest of the leaders on the call. I feel like I'm learning so much, particularly that last point, the Halo. One thing that jumps out to me that connects, like before, one step before data, that is so important, and I struggle with this too, is like the trust and the relationships and our processes have to be built on principles and not personalities. Right. I mean, this is kind of a classic like leadership paradox thing, is like, personality leadership is great until that personality is gone, right? Or great till it's not when that personality is still there. But it's really like interpersonal relationships are great and we need to build and tether those, and those are whether, but it's got to be about the greater principle of what we're doing here and those shared commitments. So in light of that, I think for us, there's a couple things with data. One, We have a lot of data, as all of our systems do. We try to be very data informed. Like we're doing a lot of system modeling right now for our kind of updated 5-year plan, which is like just, estimating costs, inflow, outflow into the system. What is it going to take to get these reductions? And so we've got more than enough data and we're looking at it very specifically. And so how do we, for us, like share data in a way that balances sharing it and not sharing it in a way kind of to Lahela's point that's not just a dump that overwhelms people and you're like, what are we talking about? We shared the whole strategic plan and every footnote with you. Like, got it, get it, good. And like I've definitely struggled with that because I'm not a data expert, but I'm a data lover, and so I love to dive in and use it. So we're really trying to figure out the comm strategy to say data needs to be our backbone, but how do we really pick the data, right? That is most and translate it in a way that it can really ground our discussions, right? For us, that was and continues to be, right, really focusing on a model of targeted universalism, right? Which for us, which as a system, I'm sure many folks in this call are aware, is really saying in order to achieve outcomes for everyone, we need to find those that are most struggling and disadvantaged. And if we can build a system that serves them, we can serve everyone. So looking at our data with that lens and really trying to socialize that, I think is very important for us. It also helps us try to move beyond the political moment we're in, right? Which is driven by a lot of conceptions, many of them misconceptions and mis and disinformation around the causes and solutions to homelessness. So how can data serve as a grounding force for us, but also stuff that we can use, which is a big personal desire of mine and professional to translate our work better to broader communities, to say stuff out loud, to be both bold but rooted in data, not caught in this like ideological back and forth. So how can our data serve as a reference for that, which connects directly to it needing to be digestible and understandable? So rooted in that for us is really about ultimately we need to use data to be responsive to this political moment, but not captured by it, right? It's so easy to be like, okay, this is the thing. And then it becomes the whole vantage point through which we interpret, and we're just reacting and trying to like combat it or like just acquiesce, for lack of a better term. For us, we're trying to say, no, 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 we want to speak to this moment, but we want to speak from the truth of the experience that people have. And here's where our data shows. So we're fortunate to have made some progress in our last 2 point in time counts in terms of reducing homelessness, and we can tie that to investments. So just the more that data can become that source of truth, the better the communications comes.
Thank you, Jonathan. I have a question. So Danielle, you were talking about how you are currently kind of building up this whole structure right now and really kind of developing. And Emily, you've also talked about how you went through a whole process of restructuring and revamping. Where do you see the greatest challenges around decision-making authority in communities or in your community? And are there places where roles and responsibilities across the partners need to be clearer? One of the things we hear a lot is like, what is the role of the collaborative applicant versus the COC board versus the lead versus, right? There's always this confusion. So like, how can people kind of have those conversations to really kind of build those structures out to be meaningful and really make sure that there's a balance, right, in where decisions are being made and that the entities or the bodies that are supposed to be doing this work are actually the ones that are doing it and not just one person all the times making those decisions.
Yeah, I think, at least in our case, I think everything comes back to the governance charter and the MOUs that we established. So we got really specific. We were like, DHCD will write the application for the NOFO. We will do XYZ. It wasn't just we will lead the process, which often is the language I will see in a governance charter. So our MOU spells out things like we will prepare all NOFO questions. We'll seek input from our local service providers, from those local homeless coalitions on how to craft an answer. And then we are very clear about our process is to have our performance review committee, which is our rating and ranking committee. They are the ones that make the final decision on what the recommended project ranking and selection will be. The full board votes on priorities, but it's because we have so many conflicted members, the actual approval is delegated to a committee. So our governance charter and our MOUs spell all of that out into a lot of detail so that everybody knows the part they play. HMIS is kind of similar. I think we're really good at clarifying COC collaborative applicant work and HMIS. I think where we still are struggling a lot, and it seems to me this is just something that comes along with being a balance of state, is coordinated entry. So that's really different because that's about care coordination. That's about local service providers partnering together to problem solve housing challenges. So where we've currently landed is a more administrative role. It's our role to run the system that collects the assessments, and we support case conferencing at the local level, but ultimately the decisions about who's coming off the list next to be prioritized for housing is a local decision. And we have not spelled a lot of that out on paper in really clear ways. It's one of our like continuous improvement cycles that we need to go through. But how we got to all of that is we did a lot of community input. So we went to every community that was part of the balance of state. We sought input on the governance charter. We sought input on how tasks should be divvied up between the board, the committee, and DHCD as the lead agency, and then ultimately came back to everybody with a finished version after it had been approved. So there was both a seeking input phase and then circling back with communities to say, this is what we did with the input that you gave us. So we've been very tactical about spelling all that out. And we did that because I had a not so great experience in my last COC with that. Governance was a real challenge. We had constant conflict between the COC lead and the board and who was in charge of what and who made the final decisions on funding. And so I learned from that experience, and probably was like a little so nervous about launching a new COC and wanting to do it the right way. We actually went so far as to have the COC have their own branding and identity that is separate from state government. So if you go to our COC website, you actually might not pick up at first glance that we're the lead. We crafted everything from the beginning to be the COC is the body that is in charge. DHCD's role is to be a support entity, to be a lead entity. Obviously, we carry as a funder a lot of power dynamics that we are really open and honest about, but also respectful of. So we recognize that not every meeting we walk into are we the ones in charge, and we sort of have to check ourselves on that because as a funder, we're used to being in a decision-making role on behalf of the communities we fund. But in a COC context, you can't do that. You have to come in more as a partner, more as an equal collaborator. And I think that's something you have to build into the culture of your staff team as a leadership role. Like that is a very intentional conversation that we had when we started and we continue to have. And sometimes I'll even check my own staff. I'll be like, I think we should ask the board about that. I don't think we should just do that. Or we should consult with the executive committee. This really should be their decision to make and to hold up and to stand behind. And so we do sort of constantly evaluate that because I think when you wear two dual roles, you have to have a internal system to weigh when do I step up versus when do I step back, and to be okay with not always being in charge. I do think you have to make those choices and be willing to sort of introduce that because your partners might not always feel comfortable. When I walk into a room, I'm seen as a funder no matter what. And our partners might not always say, Danielle, like, this is our decision to make as the COC board. You shouldn't be telling us what to do, but so I will just say, this is your decision. We've written into the MOU, you are in charge of this. So I think we worked a lot of that out, but I think for those of us, particularly in funding positions, or in a government position, you really have to be conscious of what you bring to the table, both quietly and vocally, because your partners perceive you a certain way. There's a power imbalance there that has to be respected and navigated.
Thank you for that. Okay, and so really quickly, just so we can get to some of the Q&A, I want to just, if you can give me a quick, brief sentence to say what is one thing you would recommend, if you could recommend one governance change that community should make in the next year to improve coordination, accountability, or housing outcomes, what would it be? And everybody can say something.
Can I say more than one? I think I think role clarity is incredibly important, and then maintaining high fidelity to the established role clarity is very important. People are quick to deviate from that, not with any ill intent, but because it's hard to remember. And I think that's an important staff role. And then also, um, I think it's really important to honor people's autonomy and recognize the realities of span of control. So if you the design of our COC is specifically to bring together people who have a particular span of control so that we can then collectively have a large impact in the community. I There's almost no decision I can actually make, right? I feel very clear that our COC is the decision making body. We are the doers, they are the decision makers. But really keeping that front of mind. One of our folks a while back asked me if I was queen of the COC, how would I handle whatever? And that is my dream job. That's my dream job. I would be an excellent queen of the COC, and that's not a job. So, in light of the fact that we have all of these respective spans of control, I think it is important to have a lot of clarity about how those folks come together and do that work. And then last thing, I also think when we think about bringing folks to the table who might not be traditional partners in this work, I think it is important to what I think has worked well for us is being inclusive, honoring, applying all of the same things we care about for folks in housing crisis, applying all of those same principles to all parties around the table. So I think often about that case management picture of, the client is in the driver's seat. If you're the case manager, you're helping with navigation. You might be the engine, you might pump the gas, you're doing a lot, but the client is in the driver's seat. And I think same thing is true for the COC connected to the lead agency role.
Plus one for clarity. I think reducing complexity where possible, right? That complexity and bureaucracy is not an end in itself, right? Only if it functions to be better for sharing power. And I would also say just fundamentally like distinguishing, kind of to Emily's point around clarity, like distinguishing authority from influence. Like where are the areas of actual authority and oversight? And then where are areas of potential influence, knowing that those have different roles. And that's something we're really trying to focus on to disambiguate. Is that a word? Like what is COC and what is not for our community, because as Lahela and Cal were saying, as in many other states, there's just so many players that it could never all be in one place. So how do we get really clear on that authority? So yes, clarity, and complexity only if it serves an end, not is an end in itself.
Danielle, Lahela?
I think just one last thing, because it's very timely. And I don't see this a lot in COC structures, is having some clarity around advocacy and shared agenda, and recognizing that these coalitions we've built are really diverse and often come with a lot of varying and differing perspectives. And so having something built into your governance process, whether it's a committee or it's a board approval process, that talks about a shared advocacy agenda and who has the power and authority to speak on behalf of the COC. I think that's, as we go through more tumultuous times, we will need to be louder. We will need to be more vocal. We will need to meet with elected officials. And I think sometimes COCs aren't really set up well to do that in a shared way. You might have individual members who are going out and advocating on their own, but I think every COC should have a really clear pathway for how to advocate as a collective body, and how do you build consensus or at least a majority support for some kind of advocacy agenda, even if it's single issue based. But answering questions like if your local town ordinance, your city council proposed an ordinance banning public camping, who on behalf of the COC has the right to make a statement publicly about that? How do you bring consensus around how does everyone feel? Because different members of your board might feel different things. So that's often not something that's in a governance chart. Something I think a lot about in these times is how do I rally folks together, but have a transparent, inclusive process for how we decide what gets said and who can speak on behalf of the COC.
And I will plus one everything my colleague said. And I will sort of make two final comments is that I think one is that, the role of the COC is not to ensure that everyone agrees, right? Our role is to create enough trust, enough transparency, enough shared understanding that we as a community can still move forward, even in times of disagreement or turbulence. And one last thing I'll just say is that sometimes we lose sight that our responsibility is to maintain a long-term perspective as well, right? So balancing, reactivity to what's happening in the moment. And when there's uncertainty and when there's crisis, we can oftentimes focus only on the immediate challenges. And I think one of the challenges we face, but also where we can really lead and lean in is that long-term perspective as well, right? Balancing the immediate needs with the long-term system goals and outcomes, right? Sort of because we're pre, during, and post, right? Are all the three things that we're trying to manage all at the same time. So I think that's like one of my biggest takeaways is that it can be difficult, right? That's where the pushback comes in. That's where the transparency comes in. But we have to hold that role of long-term perspective while addressing immediate challenges, and bringing your community together around that.
Thank you all. Incredible advice. So I'm gonna try to get maybe one or two questions in here before we wrap up. Emily, specifically for you, someone asked, could you speak more about how you create clear lines between the lead agency and city government in Asheville, especially with the city manager rep, and the mayor on your board? And then they also asked, can you briefly describe again how the issue experts should be on the subcommittees and not on the board?
Well, first, I don't know that issue experts should be on the subcommittees and not on the board. That's just how we are built in our community, and I think it's working very well for us. So I don't think that's necessarily universal. I think it really depends on your particular community. We wanted people with power in our community who can marshal resources, who can set policy. We want those folks around a common table. And what they have to understand is extraordinary in their roles. What the mayor of the city of Asheville has to be conversant in is so broad. It includes homelessness, but it's so many other things. And so I don't think it's reasonable for me to expect her to be an issue expert on homelessness. And I know that we have issue experts in our community who can give good advice and good recommendations to our COC board. I think it positions experts to give decision makers something to say yes to. And I think that keeps everybody in a really good seat. What was the other question? Separating city government from my role. I think I think the way that our division approaches that is part of what makes that work. So I have a lot of consistency around that and really hold true to that. So when people want to talk to me about city funding, for example, I will share with them whatever information is publicly available and also point them to city staff or city leadership who are the decision makers related to that, the same as I would do with other board seats. I want to be helpful, I want to be a helpful navigator around all of these complex relationships and systems, but I really keep myself very clearly not in a decision-making seat and communicate both internally at the city and externally in the community and to the COC that our function is neutrality, is neutral backbone support. We want to provide good information to decision makers so they can make good decisions, but we are not that decision maker.
Thank you. Josh, do we have time for one more question? Or we want to wrap up and we can send answers?
I think we have time for one more.
We have time for one more? Okay. So anyone on the panel can answer this. How do you navigate the tension between federal COC requirements, like coordinated entry, and the COC governance over those decisions with municipalities and county governance that don't agree with the decisions made by the COC?
How much time you got?
Oh, go ahead, John.
No, go ahead, Lahila. That's a great question. I would love to hear what you think of it.
That is a great question. I think again, it comes to what is the mission of our COC? What are the values, right, that we long ago established as a community? Because we each have different roles and responsibilities, right? Your county has different responsibilities than your city, than your COC. But how do you do those things, right? Compare us to like a three-legged stool, right? If you were to remove one, the stool would fall. So again, this I think comes back to like clarity, knowing your roles. And I think again that communication, like, and it's also saying we had a good reminder, there's a leadership group that we are in, and Jonathan participates in that as well with some colleagues in California, is that oftentimes we hold on to the name of something, right? Like Housing First is a great example. We hold on to the name of Housing First rather than continuing to focus on what was the intention, what are the practices, why was Housing First established, how do we do that? And so if we get into the tug of, well, we have to say housing first. No, what we have to do, and I'll just write, what we have to do are the principles. What are we trying to do and achieve when we do something? Because again, even that, right? Names change. Like we operate a flexible housing pool. I did a flexible housing pool when I worked for a county, 15 years ago, but I didn't know that's what it was called, right? But I focused on those core principles. So I think that's how some of it can be managed. And when there's disagreement is again, that conversation about what is the action? What is the question we're trying to answer? What is the goal we are trying to achieve? Call it whatever you want or don't call it whatever you want, but we will still move in these directions around these aligned goals to achieve this aligned right measure. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I think that's really what's helped us because right, we've got different things going on, but we have to work together. And I think that's the other thing too, I'll just say is that you can agree, right? You can disagree. Again, we are that neutral, right? As Emily was saying. And we maintain that role for when these times come, right? So that we can be that neutral voice, that, factual, try to keep the emotions out of it. And I'll say one last comment because Jonathan said this earlier, but this is something my CEO, Tamara, told me years ago when I started this, and I use it to this day, is take the names out of it. If you took the name of a person or an entity out of it, right, and just looked at what you are trying to do and address, that minimizes some of that emotion that can come into the work that we have it in front of us.
Word. That's great. I mean, I would just add to that, I think, from the perspective specifically about coordinated entry, because I know everybody on this call probably thinks about it all the time. Nothing is sacred in our systems, right? And certainly not also the terms. So in some ways, and I think about this when I talk to local government partners, like coordinated entry is what we make it. And again, it's the principle of prioritizing vulnerability and connection that is so important, not some ensconced existing single policy. And so for us, I think, again, it's going back to the data to say, like, who is actually being served and how do we create improvements? But we have to be vulnerable in this time to flex on those systems. Otherwise, people will just continue to operate outside of it. Like, not to drop a bomb at the end, but like, I'm not sure coordinated entry as such in its current form continues to be a federal requirement in the same way, right? Because in many ways, those changes seem to push against the core principles. So we have to hold things more loosely when it comes to working with local partners to get at the spirit of what we're doing.
Well, first, I want to say you all dropped so many gems. We are trying to capture some of them to share some takeaways. I don't know if I even did a job capturing like a third or a fourth of the great things that you all did. Luckily, we recorded this, but I mean, there's a lot of like synergy and everything that you all were saying. A lot of like role clarity, really making sure that there's like things are clearly defined. We're clear in our communication. Really relying on relationship and trust to move this forward. I think even to that last piece, the Lahela that you were speaking to, and Jonathan, you kind of were getting into, like, don't get lost in like the language of things. Get really look at what are we trying to do? What are we trying to do with coordinated entry? What are we trying to do with housing first? Instead of like we have to hold on to saying similar to like equity, right? We're trying to meet the needs of all folks experiencing homelessness. We can call it fill in the blank. We have to meet the needs of the people we serve. Right. And we can't get caught up in always with language. We have to get caught up with action. So with that being said, thank you all for sharing your wisdom. I want to say that our next webinar is on the 23rd. We and I put this in the chat as well because there were some questions pertaining to the NOFO. We have a really wonderful NOFO call tomorrow that's really going to go into all the changes, and some of the questions that you all had will be answered there. But for our this webinar series, our next one will be on Tuesday, the same time. Really focus on working across systems. We started with governance and decision making. Now we're talking about how do we actually build those partnerships. We're working on internal structure. Now we're talking about building those external partnerships to really meet the needs of all folks experiencing homelessness. And that will happen again on the 23rd. Let me see. I'll put the link here shortly in the chat. And then last but not least, I just want to thank you to you all for joining us, but also thank you to our wonderful moderator and our wonderful panel. Here is their emails. Hope I should have asked them for permission. Sorry, y'all. Hope you all okay with sharing that, because there might be some question follow up for you all. But just thank you all so much for the wisdom, the values you bring to this work, the great energy and flexibility and creativity that you uphold in your communities. And it is such a joy to hear you all speak. And thank you. So have a great rest of your day. And we are at time. Thank you all. You did a phenomenal job.
Incredible.
Thank you for hosting.